There's a conversation many of us have waited for. Not loudly, not in a way we talk about with others, but quietly in the background of our thoughts. A conversation that would explain things, clear things up, make sense of what happened. You may have imagined it more than once. What you would say, how you would say it. The moment when the other person finally understands, or finally apologizes, or simply tells you the truth. There may have been a time when you expected it would happen. You thought, they'll reach out. Maybe not today, but eventually. Time passes. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months, and slowly something begins to feel different. The message doesn't come. The call never happens. The explanation you were waiting for stays just out of reach. You might find yourself holding your phone a little longer than necessary, checking it without thinking. Not because you're expecting anything specific, but because part of you hasn't let go of the possibility. Some conversations live only in our imagination. They play out in quiet moments, while you're walking, while you're sitting alone, while the day slows down just enough for your thoughts to return to it. And in those imagined conversations, everything is clearer, more complete, more resolved. But outside of those moments, the silence remains, and after a while, that silence becomes its own kind of answer. In the next part, we'll talk about why we keep waiting for that conversation, and why it can feel so important, even when it may never come. Even when time passes, something inside us continues to wait. Not always consciously, but quietly. A part of you still holds on to the idea that one day it will make sense, that there will be a moment when everything is explained clearly, when the confusion is replaced with understanding. Because what you're really waiting for is not just a conversation. You're waiting for clarity, for acknowledgement, for the feeling that what you experienced was real and that it mattered. You want to know why things happened the way they did, why something ended without explanation, why someone said what they said, or didn't say anything at all. We think clarity will come from their words. We imagine that if they could just explain themselves, something inside us would settle. The questions would stop. The thoughts would quiet down, and we could finally move forward without looking back. So we wait. Not always actively, but in a quiet, ongoing way. We replay moments. We go over conversations in our minds. We imagine different versions of how things could have gone, and each time, we get a little closer to the ending we wish had happened. But there's something else happening underneath that waiting. We tie our peace to something outside our control, to another person's willingness to speak, to their ability to understand, to their readiness to face what happened. And as long as that doesn't happen, a part of us stays unsettled, still holding the door open, still leaving space for a conversation that may never arrive. In the next part, we'll talk about a truth that can be difficult to accept, that some people will never give you the closure you're waiting for, no matter how much you hope they will. At some point, a quiet truth begins to settle in. Not all at once, but slowly. You begin to realize that the conversation you've been waiting for may never happen. Not because it isn't important, but because the other person may not be able to give it. Some people don't know how to have difficult conversations. They avoid them. They move on. They leave things unfinished because facing them would require a kind of honesty they're not ready for. Others may not fully understand what happened themselves. They don't see the impact the way you do. They don't feel the same need to explain. And some people simply continue with their lives without looking back, without revisiting what was left unresolved. Not everyone has the ability to give you what you deserve, and that can be hard to accept. Because part of you still believes that if they just understood, if they just took a moment to reflect, things would be different. But silence is sometimes the only answer you'll receive. Not a clear answer, not a satisfying one, but an answer nonetheless. There may have been a moment when this became clear, when enough time had passed that the pattern could no longer be ignored. No message, no explanation, no sign that the conversation was ever going to happen. And in that moment, something shifts. Not dramatically, just quietly. The waiting begins to feel heavier than the truth. In the next part, we'll talk about what it means to grieve what you hoped for, not just the relationship, but the conversation and understanding that never came. When you begin to accept that the conversation may never come, something else rises to the surface. A quieter kind of grief, not only for what happened, but for what didn't happen. You may realize that you weren't just waiting for words, you were waiting for a feeling, to be understood, to be acknowledged, to have someone say, "I see it now." And when that doesn't arrive, there is something real to grieve. Sometimes we grieve conversations that never happened. We grieve the apology that was never spoken, the explanation that never came, the moment of clarity that lived only in our imagination. It can feel strange at first, to feel loss over something that never actually took place. But the hope was real. The expectation was real. The need for that closure was real. Letting go of hope can feel like losing something tangible, because in a way, you are. You are letting go of the version of the story where everything is explained, where everything makes sense, where the ending feels complete. There may be moments when you catch yourself returning to it, replaying what you would say, imagining how it could still happen, and then remembering, gently, that it hasn't, and may not. This is not about forcing yourself to accept it all at once. It's about allowing that disappointment to be seen for what it is, without pushing it away, without turning it into anger. Just recognizing that something you hoped for is no longer part of the path ahead. And in that recognition, something begins to shift. The space that was once filled with waiting starts to open. In the next part, we'll talk about what it means to choose closure without permission, and how peace can begin even without the conversation you were hoping for. There comes a moment when you begin to understand something quietly powerful. You don't have to keep waiting, not because the conversation suddenly became unimportant, but because your peace does not have to depend on it. For a long time, it may have felt like closure was something the other person had to give you. Their words, their explanation, their acknowledgement, something only they could provide. But slowly, you begin to see another possibility. Closure is not always something you receive. It's something you choose. You can decide, gently, that you have enough understanding, enough reflection, enough awareness of what the situation meant to you. You may never know every reason behind what happened. You may never hear the words you hoped for. But you can still come to a place where the story no longer needs to continue. You can stop asking questions that no longer have answers. You can stop reopening moments that cannot be changed. You can let the unfinished part remain unfinished and still move forward. Closure is something you can give yourself, not as a way of pretending everything is resolved, but as a way of saying, I'm no longer waiting for this to be completed by someone else. This is a quiet decision. No announcement, no dramatic shift, just a gentle turning inward, a recognition that your life is still moving and that you are allowed to move with it. You don't need permission to move on. You don't need their words to begin again. And when you make that choice, something subtle begins to change. In the next part, we'll talk about the kind of peace that comes after letting go, how the mind begins to quiet when it no longer has to wait. When you stop waiting, the first thing you may notice is space. Not a dramatic change, just a quiet shift. The thoughts that used to circle back again and again begin to appear less often. The need to replay what happened starts to loosen. You don't wake up thinking about it as quickly as you used to. You don't carry it through every part of the day. And when it does return, it doesn't stay as long. Peace begins where waiting ends. Because waiting keeps something open. A question, a possibility, a door that never fully closes. And as long as that door stays open, part of your energy stays there too. But when you gently let that door rest, something changes. Your attention returns to you, to what is in front of you, to what is actually part of your life now. You may notice simple things more clearly. A quiet morning, a conversation that feels easy, a moment where your mind is not pulled backward. What you release stops pulling at you. This doesn't mean the past disappears. It doesn't mean the memory loses all meaning. It simply means it no longer has the same hold on you. There is a lightness in that, not because everything was resolved, but because you are no longer holding it open. And in that lightness, something steady begins to take its place. In the final part, we'll bring this reflection to a gentle close and talk about the kind of closure that doesn't come from a conversation, but from within. Not every story ends with a clear conversation. Not every question receives an answer. And not every person will meet you in the way you hoped they would. But that doesn't mean you are left without closure. There is another kind, a quieter one. One that doesn't arrive through someone else's words. It arrives through your own understanding, through your willingness to stop waiting, to stop holding the door open for something that may never come. You begin to see that closure is not always about finishing the story perfectly. It's about deciding that the story no longer needs to continue. That what happened is part of your life, but it does not need to keep unfolding. There is a calm in that decision, a steady kind of peace. Not because everything was explained, but because you are no longer asking it to be. Some doors never close with a conversation, but they can still close within you. And when they do, it doesn't feel like loss. It feels like space. Like something that once pulled at you has gently released its hold. You carry the memory, but not the weight. You remember, but you are no longer waiting. And that is enough. If this letter met you at the right moment, you're welcome here. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments, is there a conversation you've been waiting for? And what would it feel like to let that waiting go? Take what helps, leave the rest.